you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A tab, and then we can go from there. So over to you, Dr. Bishara. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to give a little talk about what is psychology. So I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. All right, it is just 2 minutes to 4, so maybe just wait until it's 4 o'clock on the dot and then we'll start.
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so for those of you who have just joined us for the session on psychology, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to get started real soon, but just one small thing. So if you have any questions, you can pop them into the Q&A tab, which is on your screen, and then at the end, we will get to the questions. So here with us, we have Associate Prof. Stuart Derbyshire, who will be talking about what psychology is. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for stopping by and welcome to this brief talk on psychology, and there'll be a Q&A session after the talk, but I'll also be asking you for a few bits of input as we go through this. I'm going to give you some difficult questions that psychologists think about for you to think about as we go. Okay, so in this talk, we're going to consider what psychology is, and hopefully I'll dismiss some mythical and some wrong-headed views of psychology. This is William James, considered by many to be the founder of psychology, and he famously stated in a letter to a friend that psychology is a nasty little subject. He said that in part because psychology is actually quite hard. Many students wrongly believe that because psychology is a soft science, it will be an easy science, but soft, unfortunately, doesn't mean easy. Soft really means contested and uncertain. So the kinds of questions that engage psychologists, such as what is thought, how do we make choices, and do we make choices? What is perception? Is there a true reality outside of our perception? Where do forgotten thoughts go? And so on, are all highly contested questions. These are questions that seem like they probably should be answerable. Consequently, many students also make the mistake of thinking psychology is intuitive or merely involves some form of common sense. That's also incorrect. There's very little in psychology that can be deduced or understood through intuition or common sense. That's part of the reason that we struggle with these questions. There are no accepted answers. There might never be any accepted answers. In an effort to find answers, psychologists adopt the methods of scientific inquiry. So they perform empirical studies, interpret the data, carry out statistical analysis, and then write and argue about what they found and what it means. So James was right. Psychology is a nasty subject. Psychologists can't agree as to what pain is and why we have it. We still argue whether depression is biochemical or social or both or neither. And we cannot decide what our close relationship to chimps means, and so on. All these issues are interesting. Psychology is definitely a fascinating subject, but if you want or expect answers, then it can be a deeply frustrating and nasty subject. Psychologists approach the questions they ask in many different ways. So we might, for example, measure people's behavior in response to stimuli or signals. Sometimes we measure performance, some will relate it to brain function. We might even measure the activity of nervous tissue directly and then relate that activity to performance, behavior, feelings, and so on. We also measure how behavior changes in groups. So for example, if you stand alone and stare up at the ceiling, most people will ignore you. But if you recruit a friend and you both look up at the ceiling, more people will stop and look until you have a whole crowd wondering what you and they are actually looking at. You should try it next time you have a friend around. We also examine infant behavior. This is the famous marshmallow test. Infants are presented with a bowl of marshmallows and they're asked to resist taking one now so that they might have more later. Those that demonstrate such incredible self-control grow up to be more successful. Maybe. Remember, psychology is a nasty subject and we rarely agree on what the findings mean, and we often find different things in different labs. Of course, some psychologists are interested in how behavior can go wrong. Clinical psychology is often popular with students, but it is only a small part of psychology. You can do your entire degree without ever encountering a clinical psychology module. Psychology is a broad subject. There are many different areas and subdisciplines: health, neuro, sport, education, and so on, all under the umbrella of psychology. But whatever it is we're studying or researching, it's always a challenge. So color, for example, that's easy, right? If you look at this square, you can pick out the different colors, no problem. If I ask you what colors you can discern, then you're likely going to pick out at the top left as being blue, the bottom left as being violet, the top right as yellow, and the bottom right as red. In the middle, there's a bit of confusion. So far, so reasonably straightforward. But maybe you're wondering if everybody else has the same boundaries as you. And you might also wonder, why are the boundaries where they are? Were you born to identify those boundaries, or did you learn them? Those are the kinds of questions psychologists will ask. As it happens, different cultures, different languages produce different boundaries, and the areas of clarity and confusion move. So these are the boundaries that English speakers identify, and these are the boundaries that Chinese speakers identify. The borders move, providing evidence that we do learn the boundaries. But then again, maybe the borders don't move that much, providing evidence that color perception is hardwired in our biology. At the back of your eye, there are a variety of different photoreceptor cells. Some have a rod shape and some have a cone shape, and so they're called rod and cone cells. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, Dennis Baylor at Stanford measured the spectral sensitivities of rods and cones. To do that, he chopped up the retina and then managed to get a single rod or cone into a glass pipette. Then he shone a light on it and he measured the resulting electrical current through the cell. He repeated this for many different wavelengths and discovered that there are 3 different types of cone. One type of cone responded maximally in the small wavelength range, which is the S cone here. Another responded maximally in the medium wavelength range, the medium cone, and another responded maximally in the long wavelength range, the long cone. And we perceive light in the small, medium, and long wavelength as blue, green, yellow to red. These cones are distributed at the back of our retina, and the combined activity of these cones can account for color vision. So, what does all this mean? Is your perception of color a consequence of your brain or your culture? To be honest, I don't know. I don't have the answer. What do you think? What study might you propose to test your ideas? How would you do it? If you choose to do psychology, then you will be tasked with questions like this. and you'll be tasked with designing studies that can address the uncertainties and the unknowns. You will analyze the data you get from those studies, write a comprehensive technical research report to describe what you did, why you did it, and what you found. If you're interested in this particular experiment that I've just shown you, and you can add your own data to the experiment by following the website here. I would cut and paste it into the chat box, but I don't seem to have access to the chat box, so I can't do that. But maybe I can do it in the Q&A session at the end if people are interested. Another example of a nasty issue. In this image here, you can see that obviously there's a person praying. The person praying is praying alone. Question you might ask is the person praying alone engaging in a social act? Is it yes or is it no? If you have voting buttons, you can use them. I'm not sure if you've got access to them. And if you've not, then don't worry about it. Or you can type your answer into chat if the chat is available. Again, I'm not sure if you've got access to that at the moment.
You can raise your hand. So
okay.
Yeah, so you could do a if yes, raise your hand now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so quite a few raised hands coming up. So quite a few of you believe that the person is engaging in a social act. Okay, very good. All right, so the question is, are they engaging in a social act? Now, you might say that, yes, they are engaging in a social act because the act is obviously a product of tradition and not individual rationality. It's not likely that spontaneously somebody's going to walk into a building, adopt this particular pose in front of this particular artifact and do what it is that they're doing. So they learned to do this act, and therefore it is a social act. It comes from other people. Now, as it happens, that's how psychologists believed and spoke about 30 to 40 years ago. But if you ask experimental social psychologists and neuroscientists the same question today, you find that most social psychologists and most neuroscientists would say that praying alone is not a social behavior. And they'll say that because the act is directed towards other people. So it's not an interpersonal act. It doesn't involve other people. And so therefore, it's not a social act. And some social psychologists might even point out that, look, as it happens, Dr. Derbyshire, you're wrong. There is the spontaneous adoption of this kind of behavior in the animal kingdom. Another question for you is about ontological subjectivity, and it's all popped up before I wanted it to, but never mind. So if I was to ask you if this tomato is red, well, most of you would say quite sensibly, yes, of course the tomato is red. But if you think about it a bit more broadly, you might think, well, maybe it's just red for us, because if we weren't born with those particular cones in our retina, then we wouldn't see the tomato as red. All the tomato would actually do is just reflect light with a wavelength of 690 nanometers, but we wouldn't necessarily see that as red. So it's red for us. And a different example of this is the grass here. This is clearly grass, but what is the grass for the cow? I'll let you think about that for a second. Probably most of you are thinking, well, the grass for the cow is food. And I might ask you, well, how do you know that the grass is food for the cow? And you'll answer, well, because the cow eats the grass. We don't eat grass, so for us, grass is not food. For us, grass is a playing field, perhaps, or a picnic area, or just something pretty to look at. Here's another question. In this picture here, are these flowers or weeds? Have a think about that. Again, perhaps some of you are thinking, well, they're clearly weeds. But some of you might be thinking, well, if you put these weeds into a bouquet of flowers to pretty up the bouquet, then surely then they would become flowers just like the other flowers in the bouquet. So psychologists make a somewhat problematic distinction between things that are ontologically objective and ontologically subjective. Ontologically objective refers to things that are perceiver independent, whereas ontologically subjective refers to things that are perceiver dependent. It's a tricky distinction. Grass containing calories might be considered ontologically objective, whereas grass being a playing field is ontologically subjective. A broken leg might be ontologically objective because your perspective on legs and your personal associations with legs doesn't create or mend the break. But then is depression ontologically objective or ontologically subjective? Is it just an inherent part of our biology, or does it depend on how we perceive it? These are nasty and difficult questions. Okay, so assuming that you still want to be a psychologist, there's one more important thing that you need to consider. Psychology is a graduate level discipline. And that means that your degree or honors degree is unlikely to be enough for you to work as a psychologist. If you want to specialize as a clinical psychologist or a forensic psychologist or an educational psychologist or a sports psychologist or biological psychologist or pretty much any other type of psychologist, then you are looking at least another 2 to 4 years to be credentialed in those specialist areas after your degree. That said, if you don't want to specialize, you will find that many employers welcome you with a general psychology degree. So our graduates go on to work for the Ministry of Environment, Education, the MSF, the MINDEF, the IMH, Singapore Police Force, Home Team Academy, Singapore Prison Force. They also work in the private sector with marketing companies, startups, consultancy firms, research firms, and a wide variety of other industries. So like William James warned us, psychology is a nasty subject that forces you to engage in theory, research, and arguments. You must read widely. You've got to present your ideas coherently in reports and presentations. Unsurprisingly, the good news is that many employers welcome graduates with the abilities a psychology degree engenders and demands. And with that, I'll end the formal part of my presentation and thank you for your attention. I do invite you to take a look at our department website and I'll invite you to ask your questions, which I believe you can type into the Q&A available thing. Okay. So can I see the questions?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So if you click on Q&A, yeah. So you see there's one right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I got it, found it. Okay. So how are exams like? Do they require a lot of memorization? That really varies a lot from module to module. I mean, we are trying broadly to move away from just rote recall. It's obviously a little bit of a limited way of testing your understanding. So hopefully less and less, but I'm not going to pretend there aren't some things you do need to know. And some modules like biopsych does involve quite a lot of biological material that you need to know. So that will be some memorization, but yeah, we're trying to move away from that. Is the concurrent degree program for psychology still available in CHS? Yes, it is, and I believe that will stay as it is. It does seem like a monster of a subject, says Kay. Would you say almost everything is related to science and philosophy? It is a bit of a monster of a subject. I won't deny that. It covers a lot of ground. It's about us, psychology, and we're complicated creatures. And so it's not surprising that it covers quite a lot of ground. Is everything related to science and philosophy? Everything's a bit strong, but I think you'll struggle to find a module where at least some elements of science and some elements of philosophy don't come in on it. Thoughts on Jordan Peterson? We only have 30 minutes left, so I can't give you all my thoughts on Jordan Peterson. Very briefly, I think he's extremely brave. I think he said some things that need to be said and are important. I think he is completely bonkers when it comes to evolutionary psychology, and he totally overstates it. And I don't think he's ever read Marx, because he doesn't seem to understand him. But broadly speaking, I quite like him. I find his lectures entertaining and often very human and very interesting. Are psychology-related internships competitive, hard to get? I'm honestly not entirely sure about that. So you probably need to ask the students about that particular issue. How are students examined? Very wide variety of different ways that we examine you. You do have traditional pen and paper exams, although COVID has made that rather tricky in recent years, but there is often a timed exam associated with many of the modules. You will usually do some sort of research report and or a presentation and or an essay for the modules. Lots of questions coming in now and they're bouncing around a bit. Explain more about the Masters in Clinical Psychology program at NUS. That's not my specialty. Yeah, that's a bit too broad. So if you can maybe make that question a bit more specific, it'd be helpful. What is it precisely that you want to know? It's a 2-year postgraduate degree. Do I recommend taking any majors, minors together with psychology who want to get a master's in the future? Not really. If there's something specific that you want to do, then you should tailor your degree towards that. But there's nothing that's going to give you an obvious edge or an obvious disadvantage. So I would say no, that doesn't, from our perspective, that doesn't matter too much. That's become an open major. Oh yes, I see what you mean. Yeah, there's no gates anymore for psychology. There will be prerequisites to major in psychology still. You will still have to do the intro, you still have to do the stats courses, but you don't have to get a particular grade in them now. You just need to pass them. You won't be necessarily disadvantaged if you're not a bio student. If it depends. If you really hate biology, then you might be a little bit of a disadvantage, but as long as you like it and can study it, then you should be fine. Are we allowed to take modules from other faculties if we meet prerequisites? I believe so. I think that's generally speaking the idea of the CHS is to give you that broad ability. I'm quite interested in economics. How complementary are the two subjects? Well, there is a branch of psychology and a branch of economics, behavioral economics, neuroeconomics. There's quite a lot of overlap in those areas between psychology and economics. So yep, they're pretty complementary. How did I decide that psychology is the right major for me? It was a long time ago, but I was actually a maths, physics, and chemistry A-level student, and just got a little bit tired of it. And it was an open day at a university I went to. I was going to do chemical engineering, but the chemical engineering guys, they really messed up. They made chemical engineering sound super dull. And I wandered into the psychology building, and they made life seem a lot more interesting. So I read a bunch of books on psychology and decided that that was what I wanted to do. NUS Psych focuses more on social and applied as compared to NTU. There may be a tiny bit of truth in it. We'd really have to go and look at the two websites and compare and contrast us, and bear in mind that turnover in faculty means that things can change. Broadly speaking, every psychology degree has a similar syllabus because we're dictated to by the various societies that tell us what a psychology degree needs to contain. you don't necessarily need a strong science background to do psychology. I'm not going to say it won't help, because I think it would. But again, if you're okay with empirical work, if you're not frightened of numbers, then we should be able to teach you the things that you need to do psychology. What encapsulates a good psychology student? That's an excellent question. So I guess a good psychology student is interested in all aspects of human behavior, and may also be interested in aspects of animal and even plant behavior. So you're interested in what it is that gets us to do the things we do, perceive the things we perceive, and so on. And you don't think that it's just a narrow subject about, say, social or developmental or about clinical. Those things you can certainly specialize in as you go forward. But if to be a good psychology student, you really need to be genuinely interested in all aspects of behavior, thinking, and perceiving, and where they come from and how they work. What kind of research opportunities are there for students? Lots of different research opportunities. So most of us have labs. We run experiments. Again, COVID allowing, in the future, we'll be running experiments often in those labs. You can get involved as a volunteer. You can do a UROP or an ISM. And if you get really interested in a particular question, then you can do an honors thesis in your final year. Mastering in clinical psychology is indeed very competitive. I don't know how many majors exactly become clinical psychologists in the future, but it's not a large percentage. My guess would be at most around 10%. So in terms of books, I always recommend Chris Frith's Making Up the Mind. It's a really easy to read, nice overview of all aspects of psychology, with a particular emphasis on neuro and clinical. But Chris is a really good all-rounder and has managed to write a book that will appeal to almost anybody with an interest in psychology. So if you read that book and enjoy it, chances are you'll enjoy the psychology degree. If you read that book and it leaves you cold, then chances are you might not love the degree. There are a few others which have escape me, but if I think of other books as we go along, I'll do that. That's an interesting question from CT. Is the psychology field oversaturated? It is a phenomenally popular discipline. We are producing a remarkably large number of psychologists. That is true. So then it depends who you talk to as to whether or not we're oversaturating. There is a demand for psychologists. There is a demand for mental health professionals broadly, which psychologists can slot into. Psychologists do provide lots of skills that the broad job market is interested in. So from that perspective, I would say, no, it's not oversaturated. But if you want to be a psychologist in academia, if you want to be a clinical psychologist who practices in a hospital setting, well, those fields are getting a bit, well, let's say competitive. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I would look at it. I would look at the different things that psychologists do and how many positions there are, and see what you can slot into there. I believe Mark has something to say about this.
No.
Sorry.
Just clearing the questions. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So do you think it's better to pursue postgraduate studies overseas or locally? Now that's a difficult question, because it's a lifestyle question to some extent, and it's a professional question as well at the same time. So broadly speaking, the pat answer to that is that it's always better to broaden your wings and go somewhere else and learn how other people approach a subject. that will broaden out your education, broaden out your understanding, and make you more flexible. And I do think, generally speaking, that is true. If you can find somewhere abroad to go and do your postgraduate studies, it probably will benefit you professionally and personally. But a big caveat, I would say, is that many people going into higher education and then, education beyond their degree get pushed around the world into short-term contracts and short-term positions. And it can be a difficult way to live. And if you have strong family roots or other strong connections in psychology, it can definitely be a reasonable lifestyle balance for you to say that I don't want to go abroad. And I don't think that will destroy you in terms of your career prospects. It may put you at a slight disadvantage. So I think it's a lifestyle decision, and it's not necessary that you have to go abroad. I wouldn't want to say that. I think you can be a successful psychologist and not travel. Travel's fun, though, of course. Career prospects in Singapore. We want to pursue postgraduate studies in forensic psychology. We don't do a specific postgraduate degree in forensics. I don't know if the other universities do. You'd have to look into that. It's a tricky one. Lots of students like to do it, but it's very specialized, and I'm not sure if it's offered at all in Singapore. So have a look around. On most classes, face-to-face or online? Well, at the moment, unfortunately, they are online. We are hopeful that next semester we will return to more face-to-face classes. I can't guarantee that's going to happen. Obviously, we're in the, at the mercy of what our friend COVID does to some extent. But I'm personally hopeful that with the vaccine rollout, that we will start to see cases drop, the strain on the health service drop, and we'll be able to go back to a more typical face-to-face setting. How can you prepare to study for psychology? That's a good question. I mean, I'd strongly recommend that you read some books. So pick up any book that has the title Introduction to Psychology. That will cover all the major themes, all the different areas of psychology. Will get you a foot in front for the foundational Intro to Psych course that you'll have to do here. And then once you've read, say, a text on introduction, look for some specialized texts that appeal to you and read those. I would 100% recommend majoring in psych out of interest. That's most definitely the best reason to major in psych, because you're interested in psychology. Oh, yep, sure. It's Chris Frith, and it's Making Up the Mind. It's a good book. Give it a read. Maths and psychology double major. I don't think it's incredibly common, but it's certainly a very good combination. I think that would be a good thing to do. If that's where your interest takes you, I would say go for it. I personally did a PhD in psychology. I specialized in neuropsych, so I took pictures of brains for 3 years. I've been using imaging techniques. Positron emission tomography was what I did my early studies on. Functional magnetic resonance imaging are the technique I use most often now. My specialist subject is pain. I got interested in pain because pain is really weirdly capricious. You'd think out of all the things that we experience, pain ought to be really solid and hardwired, but it isn't. It's very messy, very much involves you and how you feel and your background and all kinds of things. So I got interested in that and got involved in that and pursued my PhD in it. Yeah, was it difficult? I mean, yeah, it wasn't easy, but the thing is, if you're genuinely interested in something and it catches your spirit, so to speak, then it becomes easy to do because you get a joy out of it. So I enjoyed it and was able to do it and make some progress. The key differences between psychology and philosophy, well, the philosophers, I think, have more fun, but the psychologists do more hands-on empirical work. So there has been a trend towards experimental philosophy in the past decade or two. So, there are philosophers now who do studies, but there's still a bit of a rarity. Whereas psychologists, we always try to bend what our thoughts towards an experiment that will give us an actual answer to the questions that we're asking, or at least push us in that direction. I'm very keen that the psychologists and philosophers talk to each other and engage one another and get on with one another. I think our disciplines are highly overlapping, and we can certainly help one another a lot. I didn't need to go to med school. No. I briefly considered going to med school and then decided that was way too long and difficult, and I'll just stick with the brain. Can students take core modules during year 2? I believe that will be possible. Will I be able to do research on psychology and interest even if I do not major in psychology? I don't know. That depends what it is you are majoring in. Essentially, if you want to do research in psychology, or pretty much anywhere really, the best thing to do is look through the faculty web pages of the different faculty members, identify somebody who's working on something that you're really genuinely interested in, do a bit of background reading on that topic, and then contact them and say, look, I've been having these ideas. I'm wondering if it's possible to address them in your lab. And most faculty members are friendly, particularly if we're faced with a student who's got some genuinely interesting ideas and has done some work. And I certainly won't care if you're in biology or if you're in stats or if you're in another department and you wanted to do some work in my lab because you lend your expertise and your interest in that direction. So yeah, I would just reach out and see if someone bites in a nice way. What's the difference between developmental psychology or clinical psychology? I wish to be involved in early intervention and working with young children with special needs. Well, to some extent, it's not, the question isn't really what's the difference. You will do both. So then you will have to look at developmental psychology to get an understanding of how infants develop, and look at the clinical psychology to understand how that can go wrong. And then you will blend the two. And there is a specialized literature on that topic that you're talking about. So obviously you'll read that too. But again, the point being, to some extent, that psychology isn't a unitary subject. And we break into different specialisms, but we all overlap with one another at some points, at some times. Psych with FAST versus psych with NUS medical. I don't think they offer a psych degree. I'm not sure. A double degree in psychology and music, I would imagine that is possible. Major in life science and second major in psychology, I believe that would be possible too. The differences between psychology, sociology, and anthropology, all three seem to be similar. Yes and no. So it can be really hard to give definitive answers to any of these kinds of questions, but like I say, psychology deals with individual behaviors often. And obviously sociology doesn't deal with individual behaviors. It deals more with group behaviors. So social psychologists will deal with group behaviors too, but the sociologist is more likely to be a bit more political maybe, or a little bit more geographical than your social psychologist would be. Your anthropologist, again, they'll be similar in many ways to a cultural psychologist, but they'll be more like a sociologist abroad than, say, a psychologist abroad. But there are clear overlaps between those different degrees. And so you have to ask yourself where exactly your interests lie and which matches it best. The toughest part of studying psychology for students. I think there's two parts that students find particularly tough. One is the stats. So if you don't have, you don't need much mathematical ability to do the stats that psychologists do. That's the honest truth. I'm not particularly strong in mathematics. I once was, but I've lost the skill as I've gotten older. But you don't need an enormous amount of ability in maths to do stats. But a lot of students think that they do, and that puts them off. It's a psychological problem. So if you're not scared of numbers, if you're comfortable around numbers, then there's no reason why you can't do the stats that we ask of you. I think the other thing that people find really difficult about psychology is just how maddeningly frustrating, and as William James put it, nasty it is, because you rarely get the satisfaction of properly answering a question. Most of the things that you'll be doing will involve an argument, and you'll have to write an essay that basically picks a side or adopts a side because you think the data leads you in that direction, and defend that position. And many students find that a frustrating and difficult exercise. Do a lot of people drop psych after the intro? I don't. Drop's not the right way to put it. I think legitimately, many people do intro to psych because they're interested in psych and they think they might want to major in it, and they decide they don't want to. And then a lot of people do intro to psych because they're interested in psychology, but they already know that they don't want to major in it. They just want to do an intro class in it. So we have about 1,200 people a year that do our intro class. That's way more than we take into the major. But like I say, I think that's because people do it because they're just interested in doing an intro course, and people do it just to see if they're going to like psych, and at least some make the reasonable decision that it's not for them. They won't like it. How long might it take for one to get a job in this field post-grad? I don't know. You know, I mean, that's really a very specific question. It depends how fussy you are and how, you know, specialized you really are trying to be. So that's not, can't really answer that question for you. I mean, what I can tell you is that it's the rare student that is unemployed. You can always find work. But if you're trying to find work in a very niche area, then yeah, for obvious reasons, that can take some time and some effort. Okay. Are the modules for psych difficult? I've been ignoring that question, but it's still there. I mean, everything's difficult if you find it difficult, right? That's part of the issue. So I think they're difficult in as much as that, like I say, you really do have to draw on lots of different avenues of thought in order to dig into any module. And that can be difficult, and that can be frustrating. On the other hand, it can be exhilarating because there isn't a set procedure for deciding the answer. So it depends what you find exciting, and it depends what you find, you know, interesting. But as I said in my talk, please don't make the mistake of thinking psychology is an easy degree, because it isn't. It just isn't an easy ride. You're going to have to read a lot. You're going to have to think a lot. You're going to have to argue yourself out of a corner a lot. Will I be able to tell whether I'm suitable for psych just based on the introductory modules? I would be surprised if you couldn't. I think if you really want to be more certain, then like I say, read some general texts on psychology. So the any intro to psychology text will be useful. And then, there's a book just sat here that I'm reading at the moment. You can't see because of the background, but it's Being Human. So a book like that, Being Human, Psychological Perspectives on Human Nature by Richard Gross, give that a read. Have a look around. There's a ton of books on psychology. Be careful not to get sucked into the self-help books, because they are psychology, but we don't teach you much of that. But any sort of broad empirical text on psychology is worth reading. To be an art therapist, do I have to major in both psychology and art? So that's an interesting question. I would say probably you don't have to. It does sound like that would be a potential benefit. But yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. Should I take both philosophy and psych? So the should part is a problem. You should do what you think is best for you, given your personality and your skills and your interests. I certainly don't think you have to do philosophy and psychology, and I wouldn't say you should do philosophy and psychology. Personally, I think they're great complementary subjects, and I wouldn't discourage you from doing that. Yep, data science and psychology can certainly complement each other. Most of the things that you put in saying, can this and psychology complement each other? The answer is going to be yes, because psychology complements most things. Are there any modules in the psychology that discusses psychological anthropology? I don't think specifically. I think the closest you'll come will be the evolutionary psychology module. So I touch on that when I teach evolutionary psychology, but a specialist module on it, I don't believe there is. As I say, these things can change. New faculty come in with new interests and a new module pops up. Do most psych students do a thesis in the fourth year? It's a roughly half at the moment. And I don't know if the CHS is likely to make that go up or down. My gut feeling is that it's potentially going to go down, because I think it's going to become less important overall in your degree. And more psych students doing a thesis will be because they really do want to go on and do postgraduate study and specialize in some area of psychology. Most of our students don't. As it happens, they settle for the general degree and they move into a job where they can use the skills that they've learned through their psych degree. Okay, I see that Mark's come back, and I see that also it's 4:45. So perhaps
we do want to start to kind of wrap up, I suppose. I wonder whether the gateway modules, there are a couple of questions, a couple of votes about the gateway modules.
Yeah, so by gateway, I assume not the intro modules, but the new modules that are being developed at the moment. What would you take that question to mean? That's why I avoided it to some extent.
I thought it was about the modules that students needed to pass, or to get a 2131, if I'm not wrong.
All right. So the modules that you need to do to major in psychology. Yeah. So in that case, there are 3 gateway modules. So there's the intro to psych, which will cover very briefly all the different areas of psychology. So it'll cover clinical, it'll cover developmental, cover social, it'll cover biological, it will cover which one have I missed? Cognition. So that's what the intro will cover. Then PL 2131 is your introduction to stats and research methods. So basically how to design and analyze a research project. And then the PL 2132, I think it is a more advanced version of that. So those are the 3 gateway modules that you'll do.
Between minor and major, that's a matter of number of modules, I guess.
Yeah, it's just the amount. Yeah, so you do fewer cores, and I can't remember the exact mix now, but basically you just do fewer modules, and you won't do an honors thesis in psychology if you minor.
Yeah. Okay, complementary, yes.
Always.
Lab projects, and how often do profs work, especially with students?
So I think they don't regularly advertise, really. What you will find is that you're regularly hearing about different lab projects, because in the first year, you'll be taking part. If you do, well, not in the first year, but if you do intro psych, then you're automatically, as part of that course, required to do a certain number of experiments. So you'll get exposure to the labs in that way. And then if you are interested in getting involved in one of the projects that you're a participant in, like I say, most faculty members are always happy to hear from an enthusiastic, interested student who wants to help in their lab.
We have a question about making connections in psychology. Is that a big thing?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by making connections within the department or outside the department. But how do we make ourselves stand out? This is, I think it's a genuine issue because it is a very popular major. Like, how do you get that little bit je ne sais quoi, that bit of an edge? And I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that. The best way to do it is to become really good and interested in one aspect of the course. So something like for me, in my second year, I became interested in pain. And I made myself the pain guy in psychology for those years, so and that worked. So, but that almost certainly isn't going to work for anybody else. So you have to find your own niche. I think this is just a life problem to some extent.
Yeah. For people who are intending to go into kind of social services, I mean, certainly not one over the other or one better than the other, but
I don't think so. I think to some extent that's kind of an employer question. You might want to ask people who work in that area and ask people who do make hiring decisions what they look for and what they prefer, because I've been an academic my whole life. I've absolutely no idea.
Yeah. It's probably good to go and catch the social work session as well.
Absolutely.
Go and watch that, and maybe take both intro modules as well.
Always the bell curve question. Yes, all our modules are curved. All the core modules are curved.
Yeah, I think we kind of addressed
did cover that. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, I don't see why not.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the questions come back about psychology versus psychological medicine or psychiatry.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what they teach at Yonglou Lin, and again, I'd be surprised if that's an undergraduate degree. I'm sure that would be postgraduate. But yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that. Sorry.
Okay. We did talk about this a bit, right? Doing honors thesis.
Yeah. You totally should be able to create your own research projects. It's not easy, so you have to put some effort into it. But if you have a particular interest, something that you really want to pursue, then you can almost certainly get a research project out of that.
Cool. Are there modules on the educational side?
I believe there are. So my hesitation here is a lot of students ask, how do I start specializing? And the answer is you don't really need to. So I'm not saying it won't help. If you really, really know that you want to do educational psychology, then sure, doing the ed psych modules in your final year, third and final year, is going to be useful. But don't panic if you can't, because that's not the basis for getting into your postgraduate activities. There are plenty of ways of getting into a postgraduate course, and doing one module that's relevant to your postgraduate is not going to make or break the difference.
Yeah, I think double majors should be possible, but probably good to check out on the website.
Yeah, that would be an unusual one.
Right. Okay, Britannia, you probably should check out the NUS admissions process, and then find out from there, or drop us an email, which will flash the email at the end of the session. The costs of pursuing psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that will obviously depend, I suppose, on where and things like that. If you're talking about non-monetary costs, then well, I guess.
Well, yeah.
NUS professors have been teaching for varying amounts of time, I suppose.
Yeah, from a few months for our new hires who finally managed to get here despite the pandemic, to multiple decades, I think, for some of our more senior colleagues. I've been there 8 years, if that helps.
Mm-hmm. We talked a bit about math just now. Oh,
I did answer that one.
Yes, yeah. Okay, lab modules.
Yeah, so the lab modules are historically were designed specifically if you really did want to go to grad school and you knew what area you wanted to go to, then we would basically give you a 13-week module in how you do a social psychology experiment or how you do a cognitive neuroscience experiment or whatever. So that's the broad aim of the lab modules, to walk you through the process of designing and running an experiment. In practice, it's quite difficult sometimes to do that, but that's the general idea.
Okay. Yeah, for applying for a double major, yes, I think roughly that's the way it works. But when you do come in, write us an email and then we can answer you there. Okay, so I'm just going to take these last two questions and then I think call it a day.
Okay.
Data, if you fear data, will be a struggle.
I mean, you've used the buzzword. Like I always tell students that you don't have to be a mathematics genius. You certainly don't. But being frightened of numbers, well, yeah, that's a barrier because there's a lot of numbers in psychology. So you can't avoid the empirical stats side of it.
Mm-hmm. Postgrad psych, yes, lots of reading.
Yes, that's correct. CT, yes. Indeed.
Okay, so thanks everyone for staying on. We've gone on a little bit after, and thank you very, very much, Prof. Derbyshire, for joining us today. Yeah, so we're gonna round this off. We're gonna do a little bit of a small poll. Yeah, so if you could just give us some feedback on this session, that would be really helpful. It's not very long. If you have any further questions, you can of course visit the psych web page on the FASS website. If you have any further questions, you can also you can go ahead and flash the slide, I think. If you have questions about anything that we've talked about today or about CHS in general, admissions, things like that, drop us an email at askchs@nus.edu.sg or ring us up during office hours on the weekdays. You should also want to note down or bookmark our CHS website. So that's chs.nus.edu.sg, chs.nus.edu.sg. So that's where all the talks are. You'll be able to find recordings and things like that. So if you were wondering about kind of double majors, different how they compare and things like that, there were similar questions that were also asked actually in other sessions. So you should go and check those out and find out more from there as well. Yeah, so in fact, we have come basically to the end of our CHS's the first CHS open house program. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that has been really informational, very fruitful 2 days for you. And we hope to see you soon at NUS. Yeah, so once again, Prof. Derbyshire, thank you for joining us today. Yeah, and see you all soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.